4 minutes. I know that this will be a very good conversation, and I've already been accused of being a cyborg by one of the panelists, so I think we're going to get into that a little bit later. It's a very motley crew, I will say, that we have assembled today. None of us knew each other before today, so we will introduce ourselves to you as we are introducing ourselves to each other. And one thing that I just wanted to comment on before I read our esteemed panelists' bios and get started is my orientation to this topic. And when I think about vital signs, I really think about what does it mean to be healthy in 2019. And my work is in the area of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I actually work in advocacy around that. So not directly providing services, but using things like the internet and other tools and tactics to increase access. And one thing that I'm really interested to hear our panelists talk about is not only like their work and their experiences with the topic of health and the internet and technology, but also kind of the broader political context for this, because we know that, you know, there's this synergistic relationship between what is going on around us and the anxiety that we feel and the fear that we have around our own health. So, for example, I worked at Planned Parenthood when Donald Trump was elected, and we saw an over 900% increase in searches for IUDs, and, you know, the day after Donald Trump was elected. And so it's also interesting to me how the political landscape, the social landscape drives people to interrogate their own health and claim access to their rights, and when and how we choose to do that. So I'm very excited for our panelists to comment on that and many other things. I will say overall, we have on this panel a self-described reluctant cyborg. We have an expert on failure, a consumer of catastrophe, and a product designer who vacillates between the profane and the sacred. So just a little teaser on that. To my dear, wonderful panelists, if you do not keep your presentation to 12 minutes, you will have to answer to me. I will personally add you to Roxane Gay's nemesis list. And that will be that. That will be the end of your career. So let's get started. Dr. Neta Alexander is a lecturer teaching in the Department of Cinema Studies at NYU. She researches technology and failure and serves as an assistant editor of the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, JCMS. Her first book, Failure, is co-authored with Arjun Appadurai and forthcoming from Polity Books. Timothy Recuber is a sociologist whose work focuses on media representations of disaster, death, and crisis. He is the author of Consuming Catastrophe: Mass Culture in America's Decade of Disaster. His work has appeared in journals such as New Media and Society, Context, The American Behavioral Scientist, and Research Ethics. Skyler Balbus is director of product design at Postlight, a digital product studio in New York City. Her work is informed by her interdisciplinary background, and she is interested in finding new ways to bridge the gap between academia and practice in design. Emma Stamm is a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech. Her dissertation addresses the impact of digital technology by exploring the use of qualitative, non-digital methods in psychedelic drug research. She is also a freelance writer and musician. Her website is www.oculus.com. How did you get that very prime?
No, not spelled the same way.
Okay, I was going to say, like, can we talk? That's some prime real estate. So I've just introduced them all so that they can go forth and prosper without further interruption by me. So without further ado, please, Neta.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I happen to be a huge fan of Roxane Gay, so I'm just going to talk for 2 hours. So my name is Neta Alexander. I'm from NYU, and the title of my talk is Don't Listen to My Art on the Internet of Medical Things. So there's nothing easier than to mock this woman or the extremely wealthy men and women who invested millions of dollars in Turnus. Yet, what the recent book, documentary, podcast, and soon-to-be feature film all seem to miss out is the real reason why Turnus was amazingly successful to begin with. Yes, it promised to revolutionize blood tests, and it had a beautiful, young, charismatic leader, but that is simply not a good enough explanation for the fact that the company was valued at $10 billion in 2014, and Elizabeth Holmes was able to raise over $700 million. What Theranos offered was a story, and that story was a surprisingly old one. Knowledge is power. The more frequently we test our blood, the deeper our relationship with our body will grow. This underlying assumption, to me, is much more troubling than the fact that Holmes' company faked lab results and was never able to live up to any of its promises. Much like Theranos, the Internet of Medical Things promises to use advanced technology in order to democratize healthcare, to reduce the need for hospital visits, and to remotely connect patients to their doctors. While being used to describe different categories of products, from smartwatches and wearable to implemented pacemakers, the term the Internet of Medical Things refers to the connected system of medical devices and applications that collect data that is then provided to healthcare IT systems through online computer networks. Today, there are 3.7 million medical devices in use that are connected to and monitor parts of the body to inform healthcare decisions. This can explain why a recent industry report predicted that the medical Internet of Things will reach $136 billion worldwide by 2021. And this, of course, breeds many optimistic headlines that use Internet of Medical Things together with the word revolution. And I only have a few, but if you Google Internet of Medical Things, you will just get many of those. So, while many companies, including Apple, have already turned the promise of improved health and early detection of disease to $1 billion industry, their celebratory discourse tends to ignore or deny other parts of the story. And here I'm going to switch to my TED Talk voice for a second. So, sadly, I am part of this statistic. Last August, I had a cardiac event and ended up having a Medtronic pacemaker that controls and monitors my heart. After writing about it and sharing my concerns about my device connectivity in the Atlantic, I was invited by Medtronic to visit their headquarters in Fridley, Minneapolis. And if you never heard about Fridley, Minneapolis, there's a good reason for that. It's literally at the end of the world. I went there as a scholar and as a journalist on my own expense and held in-depth interviews with 10 Medtronic employees, including Dr. Robert Koval, Chief Medical Officer of the Cardiac, Rhythm, and Heart Failure Division of Medtronic. I also interview patients, cardiologists, and other medical professionals who do not work for Medtronic, and the following research is based on these many conversations. So a few fun facts about Medtronic before we dive in. With revenues in the billions, more than 90,000 employees, activity in about 140 countries, and more than 40,000 patents, Medtronic had moved from a small company established in Minneapolis in the 1950s to one of the leading medical equipment companies in the world. The company has 7 divisions, one of which, led by Koval, specializes in advanced pacemakers, which are capable of connecting via wireless or Bluetooth technology to applications in mobile devices and can collect medical information from millions of patients without their needing to visit a clinic. A recent company brochure claims that in 2015, we elevated pain, restored health, and extended life for more than 62 million people. So Medtronic present is the future of all of us. It is a future in which the combination of nanotechnology, biometric sensors, internet connectivity, and precision calculation capabilities will transform the human body into a machine that can be monitored non-stop. Every biological dimension, breathing, perspiration, pulse, blood pressure, and so on and so forth, will be capable of being measured, stored, and compared with billions of other pieces of data. The result will be the ability to improve and save the lives of millions, but also, in a more dystopian scenario, to expose patients to dangers of hacking and surveillance. So there are several main issues that complicate the story of the Internet of Medical Things, and I will quickly go over 4 of them, and maybe during the Q&A I will mention a few more. So the first one is privacy. Koval and other Medtronic employees reassured me time and time again that the company has never sold and will never sell the medical data it monitors to sell-side companies like insurance or recruitment companies. In his word, we sell devices, not data. They also explained that their devices do not have GPS capabilities due to technical limitations like size and battery life. However, selling data is not the only concern when it comes to privacy. Sensitive information collected from a pacemaker has already been used as an evidence in court. In July 2017, an Ohio judge ruled that the information collected from a defended pacemaker could be used by an insurance company to incriminate Ross Compton, a 59-year-old from Ohio. The judge accepted the prosecution claim that there is no difference between collecting blood samples from a suspect and extracting information from his pacemaker without his consent and under a search warrant. So this might sound like an extreme and unlikely scenario, but we should bear in mind that data from smartwatches, such as Fitbit and Apple Watch, has already been used as evidence in court in at least 4 cases in the United States and Canada in the past 5 years. So another major concern is security. How secure are implemented devices? Well, depends who you ask. So according to Tara Larson, who is a Medtronic system engineer in charge of patient information security, the company devices are incredibly safe, and I quote, "In the traditional Internet of Things, these devices are always on and they are always listening. We cannot do that because our top priority is the battery life of the device. Take the Advisor, for example. The battery is about half the size of your iPhone battery, but it lasts 10 to 15 years. It is really a system that's designed to keep you in communication with your doctor every few months." However, there are several recent examples of security breaches in medical devices. Last August, the FDA issued a recall for about 500,000 pacemakers manufactured by one of Medtronic competitors, Abbott Laboratories, due to a security breach. Users of the pacemaker in thousands of countries around the world were urged to visit their clinic for a software update. 3 years ago, the FDA was compelled to remove from the market hundreds of thousands of insulin pumps with network connectivity made by the Illinois firm Ospira when a security expert named Billy Rios succeeded in breaching them remotely and revising their settings. As Rios proved, a hacker would be capable, at least in theory, of directing an infusion pump to inject a lethal dose of insulin or other medication. This was the first time in history that the FDA removed a product from the shelf because of a security breach relating to internet connectivity. So a third issue is reliability. As Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford famously argued, more data also means more noise, and claims to objectivity and accuracy are often misleading. According to Lior Yankelson, the director of the Heart Rhythm Disorder Program at NYU Langone Hospital, and I quote, "All the medical devices we currently implant in the United States are remotely connected. Because it is known that there are algorithms that can decode EKG tests more quickly and more efficiently than doctors, there are programs that automatically analyze the information patients send via their monitor. At this stage, the technology is entering the field of medical analysis, but in the near future, it will also give recommendations as to what to do." This is highly problematic since, as is the case with any new technology, these devices tend to produce false negatives. And even when the data they collect is accurate, they fail to offer an holistic view of the patient. So instead of assessing a patient's well-being, gait, speech pattern, skin tone, and so on, in in-person intake encounter with the doctor, patients are asked to send a remote transition via their bedside monitor. And this is a graph from the Medtronic website telling us how simple that is and secure that is. So while I only see my cardiologist once a year, I send a transmission every 3 months. Even when I never hear back from the hospital, it charges more than $200 for every transmission, a significant amount for Americans without health insurance, especially when we are being asked to report 3 or 4 times a year. Which leads me to the fourth and final concern, which is choice, consent, and accessibility. So there are problems both with opting out and opting in when it comes to these devices. Needless to say, no one is forced to buy the overpriced Apple Watch 4 or any other wearable. However, the question of consent becomes much trickier when it comes to life-saving technology. According to Jankenson, today, every pacemaker is cloud-connected. Even if you were to specifically ask for a non-wireless pacemaker, I doubt the hospital will be able to track one down. So behind the fact that most medical implants manufactured today are equipped with wireless connectivity features, a patient who has to make rapid life and death decisions is not likely to have the time, energy, or resources to conduct a comprehensive market survey and examine the long-term implication of each device on the market. Once a patient received an implant, she does not own or control the data her own body produces. For example, my attempt to obtain my own data ran into bureaucratic walls. When I called my clinic, I was asked to sign several release forms, after which I was supposed to receive the information by mail, not email, but mail. Half a year later, I was still waiting for it. However, shortly after I told senior figures in Medtronic about my case, a thick envelope arrived containing thousands of pages covered with graphs and statistics. The meaning of all that information would be incomprehensible to anyone without medical training. 2 phrases appear at the top of each page: confidential patient information and copyright Medtronic INC, meaning that the data produced by my own body and my own art is copyrighted by Medtronic, and this is 1 page out of literally almost 400 pages that they sent me when I was asking for my data. So I was surprised to discover that not only is the data copyrighted, but that there's sensitive data, including average monthly physical activity, meaning that my pacemaker snitches to Medtronic and to my doctor how many hours a day I spend as a couch potato, which is exactly the kind of information I'm trying to hide from everyone, including my partner. So in short, patients like me are the reluctant pioneers of this revolution. Yes, I am extremely grateful for the device that saved my life. But I still believe that companies and providers must do much more to provide patients with a better understanding of their devices. We need to have in-depth conversations about data security, accessibility, and privacy. We need to make sure that our health is not being outsourced to algorithmic systems and technology. As the story of Theranos taught us, move fast and break things is not the best mindset when it comes to people's lives. Thank you.
Do you know how to follow up the other? Oh, it's just there.
Okay. So,
Do you have to pull it over? Like? Oh, thank you.
sure.
Before I start, I want to thank the organizers of Theorizing the Web. This is always such a great event. And also the space. This is a great place. I saw Kermit the Frog. I had like really serious feelings about that upstairs. Like really nostalgic feelings. Anyway, hi, I'm Tim Recuber. I'm from Smith College. I'm here to talk about death. So when humans die, we begin to decompose almost immediately. And in fact, if you're buried in normal soil without embalming, you could be a skeleton in 8 years, as little as 8 years. But our digital stuff could be around pretty much unchanged for a long time, right? And in the earliest days of the internet, social networking platforms had pretty much no policies about what to do with the profiles and pages made by the dead. And often they hung around as sort of ad hoc memorial spaces, or they would pop up kind of unexpectedly in like year in review features or algorithmically generated, like you might be friends with this person lists, right? But by 2010, Facebook had, and the other platforms had created new rules whereby social media accounts of the dead could be officially transformed into memorial pages with a limited set of functions administered by family and friends or other loved ones, right? And of course, it's still possible to report to Facebook that someone died and request that the page get taken down. But nevertheless, the number of dead people online continues to grow. In a 2016 article for Splinter, a statistician at the University of Massachusetts calculated that as early as 2098, there could be more dead people on Facebook than living people. I mean, that is assuming there's a Facebook in 2098 or a planet. But yeah, the digital dead are certainly worth taking seriously. So for about a decade now, academics have studied digital death, but they focus mostly on the ways that the living interact with the digital remains of the dead, typically by using social networking platforms to grieve, mourn, or commemorate their departed friends and loved ones. But I think there's more that we need to understand about dying online and how it relates to living online. So I'm working on a book tentatively titled Death and the Digital Self that looks at the ways the dead and dying themselves use digital technologies and online spaces to extend themselves in some way beyond this mortal coil. As part of this work, I'm examining things like blogs of the terminally ill, online suicide notes, and digital legacy services that allow you to send video messages to friends and family members after you die. But I'm also interested in understanding sort of the prevailing norms about digital death. What are the mainstream understandings or debates about death online? What are seen as the ethical ways of interacting with the dead in digital spaces? What sorts of social presences or obligations do the digitally deceased still carry with them? So to answer these questions, I undertook a discourse analysis of news articles from 2006 to 2018 that had to do with digital death. I used LexisUni database to search for news articles with terms like Facebook or MySpace or blog or Twitter, and death or dying or terminal, and grief or mourning or commemoration. The resulting list was a huge list of articles, which I read 1,500 of, and sort of a lot of them were duplicates or not really relevant. So I ended up whittling my sample down to 228 articles that were really about this kind of phenomenon in some central way. I performed a discourse analysis of this sample, which meant first kind of unsystematically reading through a large portion of them to get a sense of the common themes, and then going back and systematically coding them for 15 particular categories. So the rest of the presentation today is just going to show some of the results of this and what I think are the kind of important findings or interesting findings. Now, the largest idea here was that there's definitely not a consensus yet. The norms are very much in flux about how we ought to engage with death online. For example, I coded to see if the authors thought that the way that we grieve online represents some new major change. You know, you'd see articles like Facebook is changing the way we die, or things like that, to see how much of that discourse was there, or how many of the articles ended up like drawing comparisons, making clear that there are continuities between how people grieved before online spaces and how they grieve today. And there's a pretty even split. 25% emphasized these kind of continuities, where 32% emphasized that there's some kind of major shift or change here. Of course, some of that framing is a result of, you know, the conventions of modern reportage, where both sides get a say, no matter if both sides are representative of public opinion or not. But in any case, what begins to emerge in these articles is a discourse that kind of mixes notions of health with other notions of authenticity. And these terms are so difficult to disentangle that as I created the coding scheme, I ended up with two categories for the kinds of general take on digital death practices, whether they were good or not. It ended up being like, well, as you'll see, healthy and authentic, or authentic, or unhealthy or inauthentic, right? And the numbers, again, suggest a pretty big split on whether or not grieving, mourning, engaging with the dead online is healthy or authentic, or is insincere or not genuine, or potentially harmful to things like achieving closure or something like that. I'll give you just a little taste of some of these quotes. A critic... psychologist specializing in grief wrote that sometimes people will only grieve in private, plugging themselves into the computer at night. and not grieving with their family or with people directly in their community. The internet shouldn't be a substitute for human contact. On the other hand, you had a grief expert in another article recognizing that I could see how reaching out to a larger community via public updates or photos could give people strength or moral support or empathy, right? So there's definitely some sense, again, that norms are kind of up in the air about what is sort of ethical or correct or okay or healthful in terms of how we engage and mourn and grieve for people in online spaces. Of course, one thing that is rarely questioned in these articles was the platforms, especially Facebook's, control over these processes. So as I said, beginning in late 2009 and by 2010, Facebook had rolled out the Memorialize feature. And there's a lot of coverage of Facebook's policies and their effects. Very little discussion of their or not, these are the ways that we ought to be doing things. Even though in other cases, authors felt free to criticize like individual people for, insincerely grieving too much for celebrities or things like that, right? But in any case, 31% of the articles discuss some aspects of like the platform's control over digital death-related practices, but only 10% discuss kind of the informal ways that family and friends and loved ones would sort of enact rules or come up with kind of ad hoc ways of doing things on their own. There was almost no discussion of what we ought to ask or demand of the platforms in this way. They made rules, and at best, people followed them, or occasionally made these kind of ad hoc adaptations in a small number of cases. And only 9% of the articles talked about the fact that the platforms generate money or clicks or something from the circulation of the digital dead. And 9% also discussed like smaller scale entrepreneurs, people who are trying to figure out how to like embed web features in tombstones and things like that. So when you walk by someone's grave, there'll be like a video about them that plays or something like that. Or these kind of legacy services that send out messages when you die. So that's not to say, however, that like public views of death in the digital age were wholly dictated by Facebook and the other platforms in these pieces. To illustrate this, I want to report on one last category of responses, which are those concerning what you might call the ontological quality of the digital dead, what kind of things they are, what's the fundamental nature of their existence. Now, since I'm not a philosopher, I'm not going to argue from first principles about the objective ontological quality of the digital dead or what they ought to occupy. I'm a sociologist, so I'm interested in the ways that people actually apply ontological qualities to the digital dead. What sorts of normative considerations everyday people actually give to this issue. As such, I found that the articles addressing the ontological quality of the digital dead broke into three categories. The first is the idea that the dead page or profile is a memorial or a gravesite or obituary, right? That was the way of understanding what we have, what we leave behind. The second was the idea of the digital dead as a sort of heirloom or artifact or an estate, something to be passed on to future generations. And then the third was this idea of a digital ghost or virtual immortality, or the idea that the dead person's self is some way contained still in the things that we leave behind, which I'm kind of labeled here the extended self. Now, I thought it was kind of surprising that given that the most prominent and powerful social networking platform basically pushes one way of dealing with pages of the dead, that is to memorialize them, you'd expect that number to be the sort of overwhelming theme, or at least I did, but it wasn't. Or it was the sort of leader, but not by much, as you can see there at 42%. On the other hand, even though we're increasingly told we need to protect our digital data and think about, even though various entrepreneurs now offer these kind of legacy services where they'll help you kind of pass on your images and your data and your passwords when you die. And even now, Facebook officially lets you designate like a legacy contact, someone that you can, have notified and take control of your account when you die. That this, artifact or estate framing only occurred in 18%. So what I found very interesting then was that there was this third way, this kind of seemed to be this more organic sense of digital death as a kind of extended selfhood. For instance, a professor studying grief and mourning was quoted as saying, "Using the web to memorialize someone you care about means that your grief is seen and witnessed by others. The person you cared about is still virtually living in some way." And this kind of framing occurred a lot. A man who uploaded voluminous amounts of information about his deceased father to the web said that by uploading all the pictures and videos, my wife and I are making sure that he will be alive for our 12-year-old son in the future. Another article exclaimed simply, we'll all live on as digital ghosts. In a nitty-gritty sense, it sounds awful, but in the long term, I think it sounds a bit wonderful. What seems like nothing now will be the something that lives on. And a counseling psychologist wrote in another article, although these persistent digital selves have not existed for long, many people now expect them to be there and rely on them in working through their grief. Bereaved individuals interviewed for my research had one overriding fear. This is her research, not mine. Profile removal. If we lost it, said one, it would be like losing him all over again. So therapists and scholars of grief today often talk about the therapeutic benefits of the continuing bonds approach. They argue that it's healthy to maintain some kind of ongoing relationship with the dead rather than to sort of achieve closure and move on, that kind of paradigm. And at the very least, the internet makes these sorts of continuing bonds more visible, much more explicit. And then if we want to push that interpretation a little bit, we can make some connections to transhumanism, especially the type advocated by people like Ray Kurzweil, or the other kind of Silicon Valley tech overlords discussed in Mark O'Connell's really good book called To Be a Machine, who think that they'll be able to, upload their minds to digital devices and, quite literally live on. It's a sort of growing movement. So social networking platforms and other digital spaces, I'd argue, can become a type of democratic working class answer to this same urge to use the digital to transcend death in some way, right? So then to sum up, public norms and concerns surrounding digital death are a lot like the norms or concerns surrounding digital life. We're not sure if it's completely healthy, despite the often profound connections we make. And we've got giant tech platforms pushing us in a few narrow directions, which we often sort of assume are inevitable and accept. But in the end, we're all trying to use digital tools to extend the boundaries of human sociality, in these cases beyond the margins of mortality itself. Thanks.
Hello. Thanks to everybody for being here. I'm really excited to participate in Theorizing the Web this year. So my talk is on screen time and sacred time. And let's get into it. So last year, Apple released a major system update, iOS 12, which included a feature called Screen Time. Screen Time broadly allows users to set limits on their phone use. Apple markets this feature as a souped-up timer and a barrier to addictive behavior and a kind of parental replacement. It tracks pickups, which is how many times you've used your phone, shows you metrics and reporting on how much longer you've used your phone on one day versus any other day, which you can see up here, and allows you to set time limits for different types of apps like social media, games, and so on. And for devices that are set up properly, parents can limit their children's screen time remotely without being present. Around the same time, Facebook and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, both released features within their apps that provide similar metrics on how long a user has spent in the app, as well as optional reminders to close the app after a user-defined period of time. Google, too, recently launched its digital well-being suite of features within nearly all of its products, along with the website wellbeing.google, which is up here. And the features here are, of course, nearly identical to the ones released by Apple and Facebook. Within specific apps, users can see their usage, set mandatory pauses or blockers. Because Google owns all of the products in their suite, they can approach these systematically as well, allowing users to combine notifications or use voice commands instead of looking at a screen. These digital well-being features claim to be designed to encourage healthy integrations of technology into everyday life so that life, not the technology in it, stays front and center. These aren't the first time tracking apps to exist, but they are the first that have been developed into these major technology companies' products sort of natively.
And even though there's no real public acknowledgement of it, all of these features seem to have history in the time well spent movement, which was founded in 2013 by Tristan Harris, who's here, who is a former design ethicist at Google. His work has since developed into an organization now known as the Center for Humane Technology, and the intention behind this whole movement is to avoid creating technology that is harmful to humanity and to realign technology with humanity's best interests. Overall, their perspective is that the technology that we have built to be the most pervasive and engaging is also the most dangerous to the functions of daily life. Over time, the Center for Humane Technology has honed its messaging, and late last year, they published this Ledger of Harms, which outlines several clearly defined and specific focuses. And those include attention, mental health, relationships, democracy, children, and do unto others. Overall, the recommendations that go alongside each of these focuses involve creating more choice and control over a user's experience of technology. And it's not that hard to see how each of these, especially attention, are clearly an implementation in the features Apple, Facebook, and Google have developed. Some of this is trying to save us from our own worst impulses. These are the impulses that bring us away from our intentions into experiences that are often disconnected from our goals and within which it's hard to escape. These experiences remove us from the real world, which I'm sure is a phrase you might hear a lot at this conference. And we can call these a certain kind of immersive experience. I'm sure we can all think of different examples in our own experience of the digital where we felt this, but one of my favorites is this one. I'm just going to throw a few of these up here, but the idea of a wiki hole, which seems to be a fairly universal kind of thing, which is just like you go on Wikipedia and you go click on a link, and then you click on another link, and then you click on another link, and then it's like 4 hours later and you don't know where you are and how you got there. Also, I thought this was great. Why is it called a wiki hole and not Wicksand? I don't know, maybe we can make that a thing. But overall, this is another experience of a digital immersion. So back to this for a second, the idea here is really about intentionally creating spaces for experiences disconnected from real-world time. There's overlap here in the work that many people are doing in virtual or augmented reality, but it still extends to traditional media experiences too. And it's not just big tech companies. Many digital spaces that work with media, especially video, love the idea of creating immersive experiences to consume that content. As a practitioner, somebody who designs and makes apps and websites for a living, I can tell you that if somebody wants something on a screen to feel more immersive, it means make it big, full width, full viewport, full screen, full everything. Total focus on the content. That's it. That's all you get. That's pretty much it. Like get rid of everything, including a clock or a system UI when you're working on an app or something like that. This is immersive. And this is exactly what screen time, time well spent, and all these other features are intended to move us away from and out of. What we're actually describing with the idea of immersive experiences and real-world experiences are two different experiences of time for different purposes, facilitated through product experiences. So again, we've got screen time, which is sort of an immersive, non-time experience, and real-world time, which is more human, more temporal. This tension between the screen time and the real-world time echoes a framework put forth by Mircea Eliade, who's this guy. He was a Romanian writer, philosopher, and religious historian who wrote fiction and scholarly works on myth and religion. I'm going to do like a very small amount of caveating here. There's like a lot of back and forth, a lot of ink spilled on his personal beliefs and politics, which can kind of be wrapped up by this comment on the LA Review of Books about all of that. I'm glad there are some giggles. I thought this would be like good for this audience. But back to this. So he published several books about myth and religion, including The Myth of the Eternal Return in 1949, and most importantly for this talk, and where all the following quotes will come from, The Sacred and the Profane in 1959. Drawing from theories that were already in discussion at the time, Eliade proposed several ideas about the interpretation of religion and mythopoetics. In particular, The Sacred and the Profane discusses the idea that what he calls religious man, which, okay, let's use as a stand-in for people who participate in mytho-religious experiences, separate their experience of life, and particularly of time, into the sacred and the profane. So sacred time, I'm not going to read this whole thing, you can do that on your own, is nonlinear. It's repeatable, it's cyclical. It doesn't end or change or become exhausted. Profane time, on the other hand, is innately chronological, temporal, and human. It is the only experience of time that non-religious man or somebody who does not participate in mytho-religious experiences can experience of time, and it will always represent that human experience. So sacred time is mythological, it's sacred, it's transcendent. It describes sort of a time before time, an original time, where one can participate in the myths of creation. And profane time is human, it's mundane or of the world, it's finite, it has an end, and that defines exactly what it is. Here again, we have two different experiences of time for different purposes. And to be clear, the idea here is not that you get one or the other and you gotta pick one and like choose your side. Both exist simultaneously, and they're directly linked. Sacred time makes profane time possible, and it's the paradigmatic model for profane time. You need to go back and forth between the two to make that happen. So the experience of linear real-world time happens only because at one point there existed sacred nonlinear time, and that diving back into the experience of sacred time is necessary for the continuation of linear time. In order to move between these two states, we require ritual markers. So the way a person moves between sacred and profane time is facilitated through myth, religion, and ritual. And in many cases, there's no real discernible difference between the activities performed in a sacred or profane experience, aside from that they take place in an environment saturated with the sacred. The point here is that it is a conscious change in experience that transforms actions from the profane into the sacred. And sacred time is difficult to enter because you need that ritual, you need those markers, but it's rewarding and compelling. The experiences you have within that are about participating in and understanding the mysteries of the universe, of existence, and of time. And this kind of experience parallels some of our most positive digital immersions. When you fall into a wiki hole, isn't that what you're looking for? More knowledge of the universe, more understanding of the way things work? But this kind of eye-opening, tab-fueled knowledge binge is not at all how the Center for Humane Technology perceives our digital experience of time. Instead, they vilify the way technology monopolizes our lives, and with fair reason. They focus on the negative effects that has on society. Our experience of these digital immersive environments is often one without linear time, without meaningful markers that reflect real-world needs. From their perspective, the goal is to create more moments of choice and to prioritize human control over our digital experiences. So again, the more immersive an experience, the more detrimental it can be to prioritizing our agency over our actions and our time. But there's no sentiment here that we ought to develop more of a holistic relationship with technology, bridging the immersive and real-world experiences. Instead, the solution seems to be that we should fragment those experiences even further. The way that screen time and the related features do this is simply to shock or jar the user out of the immersive and digital experience and attempt to return them back into the real world, where time is linear, normal, and perhaps profane. Screen time pops up this alert at the end of your screen time allotted amount. Instagram and Facebook have a similar UI, and the digital well-being tools use the same pattern in some of their implementations. But again, the idea is that once you've been shocked out of this immersion, you will now be able to spend your time meaningfully. And this messaging echoes throughout all of the features. So Digital Wellbeing's About section, again, which claims that it exists to help users focus on what matters most, which lets you decide what that really is, but strongly implies it is not your device. Even when the language nods to ideas of balance, more as in a work-life balance kind of feel, this is still seen as a split between the digital experience and the real-world experience. These tools may help us manage and compartmentalize our time, but they're not helping us transition between different experiences of time. And that's what may be missing from the experience here. There are no ritual markers that move us in and out of screen time with intention, as you might have with the sacred and profane time. And there are reasons for that. These experiences are often intentionally structured to keep users in a state of immersion. Business goals, company goals are often structured around that. And as long as that continues to be true, there will always be tension between those two experiences of digital time. But this idea that we have those two experiences of time for two different purposes is obviously not unique to the digital environment. Throughout the history of human consciousness, we've always navigated between different states of time, different states of experience. So to conclude, features like screen time attempt to make our contemporary experience of digital immersion less of a burden on our phenomenological existence, but really serve to make that duality an even more prominent part of our everyday lives. Thanks. Okay, great. So, my name is Emma Stamm, and I am here to talk about drugs. So before I proceed through my slides, I want to offer that in this talk, I'm trying to bring together two burgeoning arenas of research into dialogue with one another. The one is artificial intelligence, and the other is the field of psychedelic psychiatry, or research that examines the potential of psychedelic drugs to improve mental health. So I'm going to be putting those two things into conversation with one another, and the dialectic that I'm imagining between these two, I believe, stands to benefit epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with the production and interpretation of knowledge. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the state of psychedelic drug research today. So we're only in the midst of what some people are calling the psychedelic renaissance, which is a term to refer to this resurgence of scientific interest in psychedelic substances, which includes but is not limited to LSD, magic mushrooms, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. This is a class of drugs that's formally recognized with the label psychedelic by the FDA. It was a very robust field in the 1950s and 1960s, but with the reclassification of psychedelics as Schedule I illegal drugs by 1970, this classification effectively halted all research up until the 1990s. And right now we're actually in the midst, following years of advocacy, of a really enormous efflorescence of new research. So 2014 marked the publication of the first peer-reviewed study on LSD in over 40 years, and there are multiple different signs in popular culture that indicate the psychedelic renaissance, including a new book by the journalist Michael Pollan that reached the #1 top spot of the New York Times bestseller list just about this last year. So what's interesting is that psychedelic research after the 1990s has tended to privilege the quantitative and digital approaches that were actually developed while it was in its phase of stagnation. So in the 70s and 80s, when there was effectively no psychedelic research being conducted, we had numerous innovations, especially in the field of digital neuroscience. And psychedelic research has had to belatedly adopt these methodologies. So for the most part, when we look at how LSD or psilocybin and whatnot may be therapeutically active for people, we're looking at brain scans, all sorts of biometric indicators. But there are a growing number of advocates from various fields, all of whom are interested in psychedelic studies, beginning to advocate for the use of qualitative and non-digital methods in this field. And I'm distinguishing between those two. There can be qualitative digital methods. There can be quantitative non-digital methods, although those aren't really used so much. But both of those paradigms, qualitative and non-digital, is what I look at in my research and why people are advocating for essentially not using computers to produce knowledge about these substances. Within my own field, which is continental philosophy, some people are beginning to acknowledge that qualitative non-digital psychedelic science has a lot to say about epistemology and the epistemic predicates by which we tend to privilege knowledge that's made by computers. So what sorts of epistemic biases allow us to privilege knowledge about the human mind that comes from, for example, an fMRI rather than just a psychotherapist who's not using computers? So this is my dissertation, essentially. I'm looking at this field. I'm reading current scholarly research on psychedelic psychotherapy, that is post-1990s psychedelic Renaissance era research. against philosophical interventions in artificial intelligence and machine learning to demonstrate that the former, qualitative psychedelic studies, can be used to challenge fundamentalist conceptions of the latter. This is not my whole project, it's just a sliver of my dissertation. What I look at specifically is the rationale given in the methodology section of research done on psychedelics that doesn't use strictly computational methods. And I look at how researchers are making sense of the data that they may be getting from trials in which no computers are used, or in the interpretation process when they're not using digital methods. Why are they doing this? What does this rationale have to tell us about the way that human beings produce knowledge? So for the other section of this, the artificial intelligence side, I'm going to talk a little bit about machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now, to be clear, it may look that I'm using those terms interchangeably. Essentially, all I would need to say is that modern artificial intelligence is always reliant on machine learning. That's why people sometimes use those two terms. They don't exactly mean the same thing, but that's what needs to be known for this talk. So Pedro Domingos is a computer scientist who's an expert in the field of machine learning. He's written that the fundamental goal of machine learning is to generalize beyond examples in the training set. So this is the data that are used to make machine learning algorithms, which is algorithms that know how to auto-update themselves based on encountering new data. So in essence, what a machine learning algorithm does is it takes a pool of data. Let's say it's an algorithm that wants to distinguish human faces from other sorts of data. It may be trained on thousands of pictures, some of which include human faces, and then it can come up with a general set of principles based on that finite data set that will allow it to identify certain pieces of data from others once it's no longer under the supervision of human programmers. So in essence, these programs work inductively. They generalized from a limited set of data. Matteo Pasquinelli is a media philosopher who maintains that we can never actually create programs that are genuinely intelligent because they never supersede this inductive basis. In fact, he cites another, not a philosopher, but rather an inventor, to remark on the fact that machine learning, artificial intelligence, and neural networks, which are the modern artificial intelligence, always runs on neural networks, can never really supersede induction. So I'm actually not going to read this whole bit right here, but I'm going to go on to the next slide, where Pasquinelli comments on the origins of neural networks to explain that even though it may look sometimes like they're doing more than simply working inductively, not simply generalizing, but coming up with something new or something that may supersede their original training data set, it never is actually new. It's always interjecting these previous scientific contingencies into the knowledge that it produces. So in this excerpt, right at the bottom here, Matteo Pasquinelli gives examples of what he considers to be actual cases of bona fide intelligence. And I know that the term human is contested. I'll just say that this is non-digital or maybe organic intelligence. What I'm especially interested in is the creation of metaphors. And he relates this to both inductive and deductive logic in a synthetic technique called abduction, where you're working both deductively and inductively. He uses the term semiotic planes, and I want to talk about this a little bit before I completely dive into this next slide here. So Matteo Pasquinelli asserts that we can never write programs that rupture a semiotic plane. And a semiotic plane is essentially a context in which language and all forms of signification become meaningful. So spoken and computer languages are semiotic planes. They can emerge unwittingly. But also, if you and your friends kind of develop a shared vernacular where some signs have meaning, like inside jokes and references, that's also a semiotic plane. Now, semiotic planes are porous. They can overlap immensely. Some signs, some words have multiple meanings across various semiotic planes. Some planes are more flexible than others. I maintain, in alignment with Matteo Pasquinelli, that those planes which are produced by artificial intelligence are delimited a priori based on the programming decisions that went into making them. So certain statistical functions, statistical probability, their training data set, all of that means that they can never really produce knowledge that's truly new. So this gets into a few other different theorists, all of whom have sort of worked on these topics, but in the interest of time, I won't go too much further into this. I'm going to move on here to qualitative methods in psychedelic psychiatry. So Nishay Devaneux is a psychedelic scholar who comes from the backgrounds of philosophy and literature, and she maintains that we need to have trained scholars of poetry to interpret the verbal output of people who have undergone psychotherapy with LSD and similar substances, saying that when people are spontaneously evoking poetic metaphor or are using language in strange and idiosyncratic ways, as they might, when they're under the influence of these chemicals, scholars who are trained in making meaning and interpreting a sort of narrative from this are going to be able to bring something to this data set, this verbal output produced by people who are tripping, that a computer necessarily couldn't, that there's some sort of quantum of interpretation there that can't be automated. And she's also worked as part of a research team of various scholars in psychiatry, psychology, humanities fields, as well as some people who have worked with digital neuroscience to use interpretative phenomenology, which is a qualitative method from psychology, to make sense of subject-reported experiences, the phenomenology of psychedelic experience, that sort of moves between subjects and researchers and doctors, where those who are trying to make meaning out of this data set work reflexively and are sort of aware of their subject positionality, their bias as authorities, and the meaning-making process works as part of this sort of hermeneutic circle, and it's both inductive and deductive in some sense. And for what it's worth, in qualitative psychedelic research, which is only a tiny subset of a field of research that is already quite niche, psychedelic drug research, interpretative phenomenology has actually become quite conspicuous. So this is used in a lot of the qualitative psychedelic studies. I found it very interesting when I was reading Michael Pollan's book that he himself, after having done these drugs and become his own guinea pig, noted that nothing about these experiences can kind of reduce into a single data set. So I'm running out of time here, but basically where I'm going with this is that it contests the epistemic objectivity that we reify in these sorts of systems. And in conclusion, just a few words on the title. So the electric Kool-Aid acid test, there's my sign. The electric Kool-Aid acid test is a reference to a classic of psychedelic literature, Ken Kesey reflecting on his own experiences. And then there's the Turing test, which is the infamous test for machinic consciousness. And again, to begin with, or to end with where I began, I think that these two fields should be in dialogue because they can help one another, psychedelic drug research and quote-unquote intelligent machines, but also for philosophers like myself who are interested in the production of knowledge. These are both invested in what it means to know and to produce knowledge, and we need to be looking at these fields as well.
Yeah. Awesome. So please, we're going to open it up for questions, and I will ask that you kindly use the microphone. We have some folks here are going to help out with that, so that people who are not here in the room can also be part of the conversation, and also because your voice it's too low. You think it's not, but it is. I am just blown away by what I just heard, and I don't know, I wanted to comment and maybe ask a question, throw a question out there to get the ball rolling while you all think. Because I guess like one thing that I hear all of you address is just some of the limitations of technology as a health intervention. And like I heard that in the sense of like a hackable pacemaker, which is a new nightmare I never knew that I had, and the limitations of AI to really understand like a transcendent psychedelic experience, like how how do those things come together? The limitations of a non-ritualized screen time alert and how that doesn't necessarily really take us where we want to go, and balancing these two states of mind. I heard the limitation of a Facebook page to serve as a memorial to a real person and our living person, and so it just makes me think about what is the next step then, if we do have all of these known limitations to the existing technologies. What does that mean for how we sort of vision, a better, less dystopian, different way? So I'm interested for you to comment on that, and just in case there's some food for thought in my experience, again, my space being sexual and reproductive health and rights, where I think there's so much inequality in how people experience healthcare and experience access. One of the things that I think is a notable trend because of so much inequality, we see actually the World Health Organization is about to issue its first ever guidelines around self-administered care for sexual and reproductive health and rights, where they're actually endorsing care outside of the formalized healthcare institutions, de facto acknowledging, there are limitations to what we can do within these maybe highly technologized, but not actually effective modes of healthcare. So I'm curious, what is the alternative vision that you have? Each of you in your work, you've described some dark or disturbing realities, or I guess just less than ideal realities that we have. So I would love to know that. And then we also will be happy to take audience questions if anyone wants to kick us off with a response there. Yeah.
All right. I guess holding the mic. I guess in my own research, I'd just say this sort of as with a lot of stuff in digital spaces, Facebook sort of determining all this stuff is probably not good. As I was saying at the beginning, I've studied people who did online suicide notes and terminally ill bloggers, and they are doing that stuff sometimes on Facebook. But the really interesting stuff has been done in other platforms. There's a guy named Martin Manley who basically just created a website, about his entire life. And in all these ways, with all these pictures, and sort of with the purpose of leaving that online when he died. And you can't really do that on Facebook, right? And I think, so the options that we get are really narrow and really limited and really uncreative on that platform. And I think that's perhaps a problem. Not that I don't have a preferred way that anyone should die. You can die and leave nothing, or you can die and leave everything online, or do whatever you want, but at least you should have that sort of option. And if all we are really doing online is browsing, a few platforms, then we don't have that.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, per your interest that you stated at the beginning of our panel, and I think we were all intimating this, I think we could politicize this a little bit further.
Yes.
All of us, I think, creeped toward some affirmation of the economic interest that is vested in these technologies. And I don't think we can ever have a conversation about where we go next if we don't address the political economy of the internet and of digital technology.
Yes.
Until we get out of a system where big tech is always going to put profits over people simply by the virtues of capitalism, then we won't be able to make significant headway into getting into, let's say, a better technological reality. That might be one where, by my soapbox that I stand on, we don't have so many AI fundamentalists out there who are really telling us that machines can be intelligent in the same way that non-digital life forms can. Or one in which we have a more robust dialogue around what it means to narrativize our lives and to make space for sacred time, like in your talk, or what it really truly means to mourn. I think the reason that those dialogues aren't quite as robust as they could be is because those aren't topics that necessarily accommodate our constant consumption of these tools. I think addressing the fact that we are all ultimately subject to people who know how to game our attention and game our mentality, gain our psychology to be using these things, even when we realize that they're not in total alignment with our personal beliefs about whatever their implications are. Like mine would be that machines can't really be conscious in the same way that non-machines can. Only until we get into a better sort of economic situation, we'll never really be able to make headway on that. Sorry, it's kind of like
Very bleak.
defeatist, I guess.
I think, first of all, building on Emma's provocation, I would say that I would love a poet to read my echogram and would love my cardiologist to read my poetry. That would be a utopian moment. We can start with that. But to give a more serious answer, personally, I think I'm amazingly conflicted about this, because I've been thinking, in the beginning I thought, well, this is an issue of consent and data accessibility, so what we need is more algorithmic and medical literacy. If we will teach patients how to read their own data, then this is a very simple way to empower, right, and create this patient activism and so on. Of course, it's not that simple, because the conflict is, on the one hand, I want more data, on the other hand, I want less data. And let me explain that. So on the one hand, more data is also more stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
And if you have descended transmission of your pulse and your heart every few months, of course you are very conscious and aware of the things that can go wrong, and just the actual act of putting the monitor on and sending it, which is painless and takes a few minutes, so it's quite an incredible cutting edge technology, but it's also a stressful one, because immediately I go to places of mortality and all of these questions. So in some sense, I want less data. I think, let me see my cardiologist once a year. It's been enough for so many years, for so many patients, it should be enough for me. Right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I want more control over the data that my body is producing. So given the fact that, yes, a device inside my body is now monitoring every movement I make, I want to be the one to be able to give access to this data, sell this data if I would like to monetize my own pulse, because why not? Academia is dying, and so to be able to have full control and full access to that, and so there is this split or this tension between really wanting to know more, wanting to develop even better algorithms, better technologies, better medical internet of things, and the thing of let's just not monitor ourselves 24/7. Let's just not go by the quantify self path of trying to epistemologically think about the self as nothing more than a series of numbers and figures. So.
No, I think that's so real, because to your point too, there's also a sense of too much data in the sense of overload. Like, you got 400 pages, of your own heartbeat, and you don't know really how to interpret that or what that means. Okay, that's very interesting. Did you want to comment as well, Skyler? And then,
I'm really excited to hear that most of the things that I was thinking about have already been said much more eloquently, so I'm very grateful for that. But I wanted to add too that a lot of the work that's being done in the practitioner space sort of around this is with the idea of empathy, which I have some mixed feelings about. I think empathy is used as a cover for, we understand the problems that are facing the users of these platforms, of this technology, but let's figure out a way to commodify and monopolize on whatever the outcome of that empathetic expression is. So the idea of saying, oh yes, we know that somebody has these problems, let's try to fix them with technology, is not quite enough either. I'd like to see that blown up a little bit more, although you still run into issues of capitalism, of aligning user goals and company goals, business goals, humanity goals. It's quite challenging.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, we have a question here. Thank you so much for the mic.
Thanks for the presentation, they were wonderful. My question is for Timothy. I was thinking during your talk about Andre Bazin, who says that photography is a way for us to mummify ourselves, just like the mummies did, preserve ourselves after death. Edison created the phonograph so we could hear our dead relatives' voices after they die. And of course, Disney's head is in a freezer somewhere. McLuhan says that technology is an extension of ourselves, and I just wonder, perhaps media and technology has always been meant for the dead. Perhaps we're misunderstanding the origins of how this has been framed, prioritizing living over the dead, but in fact there's so many instances where the dead were prioritized first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. There's certainly a sort of history, going back the sort of proto-cinema, that magic lantern shows and things like that were supposed to sort of, use early cinema as like a ghostly conjuring thing. I was thinking when you were talking about Walter Benjamin, who also writes about photography capturing these sort of aura. His early use of aura was more in the sort of spiritualist sense, where it's like literally the aura of someone who died is sort of invested in a photo. So I think that's true. And I think to a certain extent, I mean, if there's a critique built in, and it sort of echoes what we've been talking about, is that there's a sort of artistry and playfulness to, thinking about photography or moving images as a way to conjure the dead, or photography as a way to, capture the dead and return to the dead. There's a sort of accidental quality to what happens most of the time online. Like, oh, you died, there's stuff you left behind. And there isn't a lot of intentionality around that, except in some really like interesting cases that aren't the norm typically. I think if there's a critique there, is that I like this sort of artistry. I'm interested in the way people intentionally use digital spaces in other circumstances. For instance, I studied like digital suicide notes and blogs of the terminally ill, where people are much more intentional about how they engage with death and how they think about what they're going to leave behind. I think that's not a bad thing to think about. Because I think most of the time we're caught off guard by that stuff, and it's not so much at the forefront anymore of how we think of our digital remains.
Yeah, I'm also struck by the kind of the privilege of that, of like being able to plan ahead for your death, and how many like great ambitious men feel the need to like leave that legacy behind, or also, to use another bleak example, I feel like we're getting a little bit dark today, like school shootings, or like, various like acts of terror or shootings or violence, where they often serve as this opportunity to leave behind like a manifesto, often for young angry men, and that is driven by the desire to live on in the digital space. I just think that's a sort of macabre version. So I think we had another question in the middle there. Yeah.
I have a question for Emma. I don't recall the specifics or the facts necessarily, so if other people in the audience know the actual details, feel free to chip in. I remember maybe about a year ago, researchers put several AI networks in communication with one another, and they began forming their own language. And I just wanted to know kind of how you felt that would relate to Pasquinelli and his ideas of abduction and knowledge production and things like that.
Sure, absolutely. Machines can form their own language. Certainly a machine learning algorithm can come up with a new coding language, or even a new language that might seem something like a human non-digital spoken language. The idea, though, is that it's going to either be recombining or statistically based on a sort of statistical probabilistic algorithm, coming up with semiotics that appear to be new, but that again are coming from a delimited training data set, and also a contingent set of machinic factors. So for example, what AI is essentially bundled functions of computational probabilistic statistics that may be taking in new data sets, but they're still delimited by those mathematical functions. So just in the same way that you could take 5 million songs and take little bits and pieces from that and come up with a new song, what it is essentially a recombination. And I'm making an ontological distinction between something like that and something that you would write on your own. I'm not necessarily saying that humans or non-digital intelligences create anything out of a vacuum, but I am saying that there is some sort of distinction between that form of intelligence that creates something ostensibly original from this way of producing the quote-unquote new that comes out of machinic intelligence. And that's a controversial thing to say. But again, that it's also based on some philosophical reasoning as well about what it means to create, what creativity and imagination really are.
Looks like we have one here.
Another question for Emma, I'm going to refer back to one of the slides, but I was interested in this idea you had that...
I'm sorry, are you talking?
Who's the question?
Who's the
oh,
question?
sorry, for Emma. Yeah.
I can't really hear you that well.
Oh, no worries, I'll speak up. So, you mentioned this idea that machine learning and AI kind of reduces its view of the world to this sort of single semiotic plane.
It can reduce what?
Hang on, I will find your notes. So you said machine learning reduces subjects to a specific semiotic plane, and it's this kind of, it sort of sees things in terms of this sort of empirical view of the world as samples and averages and deviations. And I was wondering, I mean, obviously there's sort of engineering reasons for this because this is how the models work, but how much of this is cultural? Like the conception of machine learning has come from a kind of corporate culture and a culture that's steeped in this sort of engineering empirical ideology, and is it possible to imagine ways we could use technology to understand things in different ways, or is this kind of like, is this a property of the technology or of the people who are developing it and making it?
Well, first of all, in reducing subjects to a semiotic plane, first of all, I would not mean to imply that it would just be one semiotic plane. There are multiples going on there, and also non-digital organisms are using semiotic planes as well. The distinction is that these contexts of signification are not quite as porous and not as capable of abductive or deductive reasoning. So I think that's an important distinction to make out of the gate. I'm not sure that I could say that it's cultural, because machine learning, artificial intelligence, neural networks as a subset of AI, that is the prevalent modern way of doing AI now. This is global. This is how machine learning works, regardless of who's designing these programs or where they are designing these programs. However, in terms of what is actually, I think, a bit of a different question, but maybe something that you're getting at as well. There is a deep philosophical bias to what I am doing, and I acknowledge that. It comes out of my own beliefs and also my own scholarly training in continental philosophy. There are ways of seeing non-organic life forms as also having some sort of animism. There could be an animistic intelligence, for example, in the Shinto religion, wherein objects and things that I would not normally think of as having consciousness or intelligence, there's some sort of relationship to a transcendent or their own sort of internal essence of intelligence. And I think that's a really interesting way to be talking about machinic intelligence. I don't happen to agree with it. I genuinely do not believe that computers have or can ever have consciousness, but I do recognize that different religious traditions, different cultural traditions, not based on the technology itself, but more on long-standing knowledge and wisdom traditions, may be able to ascribe that capacity to them. But it doesn't have to do with the technological programming. That's what I would say.
So we are going to have to end on that note. One last round of applause for our panelists. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.